Let's bring in now to talk about our top story tonight, the terror threats, as outlined last night by the ASIO boss Mike Burgess, and why this agenda appears to be so different from the Albanese government. Let's bring in Strategic Analysis Australia Director Peter Jennings. Peter, welcome to the show. Look, I spoke at the start of this program, the start of the hour, about how last night ASIO boss Mike Burgess clearly said that the threat from China, espionage and foreign interference is a certainty. He said that in terms of terror threats, it's Islamic terror that poses the greatest risk to Australia. Yet you never hear any Albanese government ministers speaking about this. It doesn't appear to be on their agenda. What do you think about this?
Well, good evening, Shari. It's curious, isn't it? And of course, Mike Burgess is a public servant and official. What makes him a little different, I think, from many of his cohort is that he has his own act, the ASIO Act, which makes him responsible for making a number of these key intelligence determinations. And he's also a person of, pretty independent mind. And I think, thank goodness that Mike has created a process whereby at least once a year he gives a speech which sets out a security assessment. Why is the government not talking about these things? Well, on China, it's because they are pretending that we have a stabilised relationship, the thing that enabled some elements of trade to resume and which allowed Anthony Albanese to go following the footsteps of Gough Whitlam 50 years after his visit to Beijing. But the truth of the matter is, in terms of cyber hacking, counter-intelligence, China is aggressively moving against Australia and plans to dominate the Indo-Pacific region. The government simply doesn't want to talk about this because it cuts across its narrative of we have stabilised the relationship with China. And on the terrorism front, I think the reason is quite simply that really from the outrageous Hamas attacks on Israel on the 7th of October last year, too much of the government's attention was focused on how do we sort of soften this message so as not to offend Muslim Australians who our government believes votes for them. And so they talk in the softest possible terms. They can never mention anti-Semitism separately from also talking about anti-Islamicism, although frankly I don't see much of that in the Australian community these days. It's all about softening a domestic political message. And it's a good thing that Mike Burgess is there to actually remind us that terrorism continues to be a problem and that we are, frankly, right now, in the fight of our lives in dealing with an aggressive China, which is engaging in spying on Australia 24/7.
Look, it's so concerning, and I agree with you, and I made the same points earlier in the night that the government's political reasons, its political motivations are part of the reason it hasn't been so vocal about the terror threat. But Peter, do you think it's curious that the terror threat in Australia was lowered in November 2022, and yet here we have last night Mike Burgess speaking very clearly that there is a significant or a realistic, I think his term was, realistic possibility of an Islamic terror attack. And yet the threat hasn't been raised. We know the threat is higher than it was because there's been a 600% or 700% jump in anti-Semitic incidents, both physical, both violent and death threats, yet no terror threat has been raised. What do you think's gone on here?
So, Shari, there was a case in late 2022 to lower the threat warning, and that was after several years of, frankly, a lack of domestic terrorism incidents. What I think is really passing strange in the current circumstance was that after the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October 2023, the threat level wasn't raised, even though we began to see the most alarming, violent, extremely aggressive, extremely anti-protests taking place almost from within 24 hours of the Hamas attack. As of course we all know, on the steps of the Sydney Opera House, but then weekly, frankly, thereafter in Sydney and Melbourne and in a number of other Australian capital cities. Match that with, as you say, the appalling level of threats which have been made against Jewish Australians, the extremely violent and aggressive information which is put forward on social media by proponents of the Palestinian cause, that is to say, extremist proponents of the Palestinian cause, and people who really don't bother to hide their support for Hamas, a terrorist organisation. Why did we not? Why did our officials and our government not think about lifting the terrorist threat level at that time? Again, I think the answer to that goes back to the government's domestic political view, which is let's keep this soft for an important constituency that tend to vote Labor. If you read Mike Burgess's speech carefully, he's really saying, look, don't worry too much about the threat level. Understand that terrorism is now a live problem, a persistent problem here in Australia. And frankly, he is, I think, the only person I have heard say that clearly, apart from you and I and a few commentators, Shari, since October 7 of last year.
So you kind of have to read between the lines of his speech to say, to potentially he might not be agreeing with the threat level, and he might be telling us, ignore the threat level, this is a real threat. And it's terrifying.
I think you can read that in the speech.
Yeah. Peter Jennings, you've been involved in the national security space for a long time. Really appreciate you coming on the program tonight.